Zubaida Begum had lived her entire life believing that a mother's role was to give silently and endure patiently. She was the kind of woman who never complained even when life gave her more pain than comfort. After losing her husband early in her marriage, she became both mother and father to her only son Cameron, waking up before sunrise to prepare his school lunch, staying up late to check his notebooks, and standing in long lines at government offices just to make sure his future was secure. She worked as a government school teacher for over 30 years, not because the salary was good, but because it was stable, and stability was the only gift she wanted to give her child. Every promotion she received was celebrated not with new clothes for herself, but with better opportunities for Cameron. When he wanted to attend a private college, she sold her wedding jewelry without hesitation. When he dreamed of studying business, she ignored her own failing health, convincing herself that sacrifices were temporary, but a child's success was permanent. And when Kamran finally announced that he wanted to start his own business, Zubaida Begum felt a mix of fear and pride. Fear because she knew how risky businesses could be, and pride because her son had big dreams. Kamran spoke passionately about profits, growth, and independence, and Zubaida Begum listened quietly, not fully understanding the technical details but fully trusting the person speaking. He told her that banks required security, collateral, something valuable to guarantee the loan, and without even being asked directly, Zubaida Begum offered her house, the small but dignified home that carried decades of memories, the walls that had heard lullabies, prayers, and silent tears. She went to the bank with him, signed the mortgage papers with trembling hands but a steady heart, telling herself that a roof can always be rebuilt but a son's confidence must never be shaken. At first, everything seemed hopeful. Kamran started dressing better, talking louder, dreaming bigger. Syra, his wife, began upgrading the household, buying expensive curtains, branded appliances, and talking about status, while Zubaida Begum stayed in the same small room at the back of the house, happy simply watching her family move forward. But slowly she began to notice things that made her uncomfortable. Conversations would stop when she entered the room. Decisions were made without asking her opinion. Her simple food choices were mocked as old-fashioned. And one evening Kamran casually mentioned that transferring the house ownership to his name would make dealings with the bank easier. He said it was just paperwork, just a formality, and that nothing would change. Zubaida Begum felt a brief hesitation, not because she didn't trust her son, but because that house was the last thing that still belonged to her identity. Yet the moment she saw Kamran's impatient expression, she pushed her doubts aside, reminding herself that motherhood meant choosing your child over yourself every single time. She signed the documents without reading them, without asking questions, without imagining consequences, because in her world, a son could never misuse his mother's trust. But from that very day something invisible shifted inside the house. Syra's tone became sharper, Kamran's patience thinner, and Zubaida Begum's presence less necessary. Meals were served without calling her. Plans were made without informing her. And slowly, quietly, painfully, the woman who had built the family with her. Sacrifices began fading into the background, unaware that the foundation she had offered to save her son's future was now being used to erase her place in that very future. After the house was officially transferred to Kamran's name, Zubaida Begum did not immediately realize what she had lost, because the loss did not arrive loudly or suddenly. It came quietly, disguised as small changes that were easy to ignore at first, like the way Syra stopped asking her what she wanted to eat, or how Kamran began making financial decisions without even mentioning them to her. Zubaida Begum kept telling herself that these were normal adjustments, that young families needed space, that elders should step back gracefully. But deep inside her heart she felt a growing emptiness, a sense that she was slowly being erased from a life she had built with her own hands. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and with every passing day her role in the house became smaller. She was asked to stay in her room more often because guests were coming. Her morning prayers were interrupted by irritated sighs, and her simple habits were treated like inconveniences. Syra began controlling the household with authority, locking cupboards, counting groceries, and making indirect comments about expenses, often saying things like times are hard while looking directly at Zubaydah Begum, as if her existence itself was part of the financial burden. Kamran, who once could not sleep without hearing his mother's voice, now avoided eye contact. Always busy, always stressed, always too tired to listen. And whenever Zubaydah Begum tried to remind him of the sacrifices she had made, he would shut the conversation down by saying she was being emotional or negative, making her feel guilty for even speaking. One afternoon, while sitting alone in her room, Zubaydah Begum overheard a conversation between Kamran and Syra that she was never meant to hear. They were discussing future plans for the house, renovations, resale value, and even moving abroad. And not once did they mention her. Not once did they ask where she would go or how she would live. That was the moment something broke inside her, because she finally understood that she was no longer seen as family but as an obstacle, a liability attached to property papers. Shortly after that, Kamran brought up the idea that changed everything. He sat across from her, not as a son but as a manager presenting a difficult decision, and explained that the business was under pressure. Expenses were high, and maintaining a household with an elderly person was becoming financially challenging. His words were polite but cold, rehearsed, and carefully chosen to sound reasonable. Then he suggested that an old age home would be a better environment for her, where she would receive care, company, and medical attention. Zubaydah Begum felt her body go numb as she listened, because the same son for whom she had mortgaged her home was now calculating her cost of living. She wanted to scream, to remind him of the nights she stayed awake, worrying about his future, the meals she skipped so he could eat better, the dreams she buried so his could grow. But no sound came out. Only silence, heavy and suffocating. Ali, her grandson, stood at the doorway listening, his young heart confused and helpless, unable to understand how love could disappear so easily. A few days later, without ceremony, without discussion, without even a proper goodbye, Zubaydah Begum was taken to a modest old age home on the outskirts of the city, her belongings packed into 2 small bags, her life reduced to necessities. Kamran avoided her eyes during the drive. Syra looked relieved, and Ali cried quietly in the back seat. Zubaydah Begum did not cry, not because she was strong, but because she was exhausted. Exhausted from giving, from forgiving, from hoping. That first night at the old age home, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to unfamiliar sounds, surrounded by strangers who carried their own stories of abandonment. And for the first time in her life, she asked herself a question she had never allowed before, a question that echoed in the silence of that room and refused to let her sleep. Was my silence my biggest mistake? The days inside the old age home slowly began to blur into one another for Zubaydah Begum. Mornings arrived without purpose, and nights ended without rest. She followed a routine only because routine kept her mind from collapsing under the weight of unanswered questions. Every day she waited near the reception phone, not because she expected Kamran to call, but because a part of her still refused to believe that a son could erase his mother so completely. Weeks passed, and the phone never rang for her. Birthdays came and went unnoticed, and even her health began to decline. Not suddenly, but steadily, as if her body too had accepted abandonment as a permanent state. The old age home was filled with people like her, men and women who once held authority in their families, but were now treated like forgotten files stored away. Listening to their stories forced Zubaydah Begum to confront a painful truth, that her suffering was not unique. It was part of a pattern where love was conditional and respect expired with usefulness. One evening she fell ill and had to be taken to a local clinic, and as she lay on the hospital bed staring at the ceiling, she realized something terrifying. If she were to die there, quietly, no one from her family might even come to collect her body. That realization did something profound to her. It stripped away fear and replaced it with clarity. Because when a person understands they have nothing left to lose, they finally gain the courage to speak. A few days later, a notice was posted on the board of the old age home announcing a legal awareness session for senior citizens. Most residents ignored it, believing law had never protected them when they needed it most. But Zubaida Begum attended quietly, sitting at the back of the room, listening as a lawyer explained elder rights, property exploitation, and emotional abuse. Each word felt personal, as if someone were reading chapters from her life. When the session ended and questions were invited, Zubaida Begum's hands trembled as she stood up. Her voice was weak, but steady, and she narrated her story in fragments, not dramatically, not emotionally, but honestly. And the room fell silent. The lawyer, Advocate Fahim Ahmed, asked her to meet him privately. And during that meeting, he reviewed the documents she had signed, listened carefully to the circumstances under which the property was transferred, and told her something she had not heard in years: that she had rights, that consent obtained through emotional pressure was not valid, that a mother trusting her son did not make her foolish. It made her human. Zubaida Begum felt years of guilt begin to dissolve, because for the first time the blame was shifted away from her silence and placed where it belonged. Fahim advised her that taking legal action would not be easy. It would require courage, patience, and the willingness to face her own son in court. The thought terrified her. The idea of standing against Cameron felt unnatural, almost sinful, because society had taught her that a mother must forgive everything. But as she returned to her small room that night, she looked at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Tired eyes, bent shoulders, and a life reduced to survival. And in that quiet moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She decided that if remaining silent meant disappearing, then speaking the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way left to exist. And with that decision, Zubaida Begum took the first step toward reclaiming not just her house, but her dignity. The day of the court hearing arrived with a quiet storm inside Zubaida Begum's heart. She woke up before sunrise, her hands trembling as she adjusted her worn shawl. Her mind replayed every memory of Kamran, the son she had raised with love, who had now become a stranger in his own mother's life. The old age home staff accompanied her to the court, giving her a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. And as she entered the courtroom, the cold marble floors and echoing walls seemed to magnify every step she took. The judge, a stern-looking woman named Justice Samina Tariq, called the session to order, and Zubaida Begum felt the weight of a lifetime of neglect pressing down on her. Kamran entered next, looking composed but with a faint flicker of surprise when he saw his mother. The lawyers presented their arguments. Advocate Fahim Ahmed spoke first, calmly outlining the case: how emotional manipulation and undue influence had been used to transfer property, and how the law was clear in protecting the rights of elderly citizens. Kamran's lawyer tried to counter with claims of voluntary transfer, but Zubaida Begum, sitting quietly, felt a strange sense of resolve. When the judge asked if the plaintiff wished to speak, she rose slowly, her voice at first barely audible. But as she recounted her journey, the love, the betrayal, the loneliness, the courtroom listened in rapt silence. She described waking up each morning in fear of being forgotten, waiting for calls that never came, the nights of pain when she cried herself to sleep, the humiliation of realizing that the son she had trusted had chosen greed over family. Every word was met with the stillness of truth, and even Kamran's face changed, a shadow of guilt crossing his features. Fahim guided her, ensuring she stayed composed, and as the questioning continued, Zubaida Begum courageously explained the manipulation, the pressure, the subtle threats disguised as advice. The judge nodded, taking notes, and the air felt heavy with tension. Later, Kamran was asked to respond. His voice wavered. Slightly, his defenses felt hollow compared to the honesty of his mother. Witnesses from the old age home spoke about her character, about her patience, about the dignity with which she had endured years of neglect, and when the final arguments were made, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The judge, after careful consideration, delivered her verdict, acknowledging Zubaydah Begum's rights, ordering the property to be returned, and stressing the importance of family responsibility and respect. Tears streamed down Zubaydah Begum's face, not just for the victory, but for reclaiming her identity, her voice, her place in a world that had tried to erase her. As she left the courtroom, the sun shining warmly on her face, she felt lighter, as if years of invisible chains had finally fallen away. And though Kamran remained silent beside her, she no longer felt fear or anger, only a profound sense of liberation, because she had proven that love should never be taken for granted, and that courage, even in the quietest hearts, can challenge the strongest betrayal. After the court victory, Zubaydah Begum stepped into a new chapter of life, walking slowly through the streets she had once wandered with anxiety, each step a reminder of her regained dignity and strength. Her neighbors greeted her warmly, some with shy smiles, others with admiration, as word of her perseverance spread throughout the community. She realized that the years of silence and neglect had forged a resilience within her that could not be shaken. She began spending her mornings in the garden of the old age home, planting flowers, feeling the soil slip through her fingers, a symbolic act of nurturing not just the plants but herself. The afternoons were often spent reading to other residents, sharing stories of courage and hope, laughter echoing through the halls where once there was only quiet resignation. Kamran, though still hesitant, began to visit occasionally. And slowly, the walls between mother and son began to show cracks of understanding. She did not rush forgiveness, but allowed her presence and patience to guide him toward reflection. Neighbors and family members who had previously doubted her now approached with respect, offering small gestures of support, gifts of food, invitations to tea, and through these interactions, Zubaydah Begum rediscovered a sense of belonging she had feared lost forever. She also reached out to local women's groups, sharing her story to inspire others facing manipulation or neglect. She found herself speaking with confidence at small gatherings, her voice steady, her message clear, that dignity, courage, and self-respect are never too late to reclaim, and that standing firm against injustice is not only a personal victory, but a lesson for the entire community. Evenings were quiet and contemplative. Yet no longer lonely as she wrote letters to friends, kept journals, and reflected on the journey she had endured. Every memory of betrayal was now tempered by the knowledge of her own strength. The subtle joys of daily routines, the aroma of fresh tea, the warm sunlight on her hands, the laughter of children playing outside the old age home, reminded her that life, even after hardship, could be beautiful. She also began mentoring younger women in her neighborhood, encouraging them to assert their rights and to value themselves, building a ripple of empowerment that extended far beyond her own story. And though the pain of past neglect never fully vanished, it no longer defined her. Instead, it became the foundation upon which she constructed a life of purpose, joy, and respect. Her home filled with visitors who came not to take but to give, not to manipulate, but to share. And in these moments, Zubaydah Begum felt a profound peace settle over her, knowing that she had not only reclaimed her property and her rights, but her identity and self-worth. She walked each day with a quiet pride, carrying within her the certainty that courage and integrity had the power to transform even the darkest chapters into stories of triumph, a testament that no matter how late in life, one can rise, rebuild, and inspire countless others simply by standing firm in truth and love. After the long, painful confrontation with Max and Lena, Renate sat alone in her quiet living room, the echoes of betrayal and humiliation still ringing in her mind. She could feel the adrenaline slowly subsiding, leaving behind a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity. The familiar space that had once felt like a hub of activity and control, a place where she organized their lives and ensured their comfort, now seemed eerily calm, almost sacred. Every object, every chair, every corner was a witness to years of generosity, to a life spent prioritizing others at the cost of her own peace. She ran her hands over the smooth surface of the dining table, recalling the countless hours she had spent balancing checkbooks, making transfers, and planning for Max and Lena's future. Each calculation, each effort had been made with love, but now it felt like a ledger of betrayal. Renate's thoughts drifted to the exact numbers she had painstakingly calculated just a few days ago. $33,400 over 3 years. It wasn't just money, it was the time she sacrificed, the hobbies she abandoned, the friendships she neglected, and the health she compromised. Her body ached slightly from years of tension, but there was also a lightness she had not felt in decades. For the first time, the heavy responsibility she had carried was lifting. She took a deep breath, savoring the freedom in the air, realizing that for so long she had been invisible in her own life, acting like a caretaker for adults who treated her like a resource rather than a mother. Now, she could reclaim that space for herself. She got up and walked to the kitchen, her movements slow but deliberate. She poured herself a cup of coffee, the aroma filling the room, warm and comforting. Sitting at the table, she gazed out the window at her garden, noticing the subtle bloom of early spring flowers she had planted months ago but never had the time to appreciate. Birds chirped in the background, a gentle reminder of life continuing beyond the chaos of family manipulation. Renate allowed herself to imagine a life no longer dictated by the constant emergencies of others, a life where her decisions, her comfort, and her happiness mattered first. Her phone remained silent now, the usual barrage of messages from Max and Lena replaced by nothingness, a quiet she hadn't experienced in years. She thought back to the calls she had ignored, the messages she had deleted without reading. It was not cruelty. It was protection, a boundary she had finally drawn after being exploited for so long. Renate realized that boundaries were not walls of separation, but rather structures that preserved dignity and peace. For the first time, she could breathe without calculating the potential cost to someone else's happiness or survival. Renate's mind then wandered to the lawyer, Mr. Weber, and the clarity he had provided. His reassurances, his expertise, had reminded her that she was not powerless. She had every right to defend her life, her privacy, and her finances. She reflected on how professional support combined with personal boundaries could create a shield against manipulation. The thought of Max and Lena plotting, spending money they didn't have to hire lawyers to challenge her, seemed almost surreal now. The audacity of their actions contrasted sharply with the years she had spent giving silently, lovingly and unquestioningly. She smiled faintly, thinking how ironic it was that she had spent decades teaching generosity and empathy, only to be tested in the harshest way possible by those closest to her. Hours passed, and Renate finally decided to act on the practical steps she had planned. She began by reviewing her finances one more time, ensuring that every account was secure, every automatic transfer canceled, and every access point controlled by her alone. This process was meticulous, each click and signature a small act of liberation. She then made a list of the locks to be changed, the security cameras to be installed, and the notifications to police that would ensure her safety. As she compiled her notes, she realized how empowering it was to take control, not just over her money, but over her entire environment. Each item on the list symbolized a reclaiming of territory, a statement that her life was no longer negotiable. Renate's thoughts then shifted to the emotional dimension of her journey. She remembered the visits with Eleanor, the warmth of an empathetic stranger who understood her pain. Eleanor's stories of her own family struggles, of reclaiming independence and dignity, inspired a quiet resolve in Renate. She understood that emotional support could be found outside toxic family dynamics, that meaningful relationships were built on respect, honesty, and genuine care rather than obligation or manipulation. Renate allowed herself to feel gratitude for Eleanor and for the few authentic friendships that had persisted despite her years of being overextended and undervalued. By late afternoon, the sun had begun to set, casting golden light across her living room. Renate found herself sipping her coffee again, now cooled, and thinking about small pleasures she had neglected, reading novels she loved, tending to her garden without worry, cooking for herself, enjoying music without planning it around someone else's schedule. These simple acts, once overshadowed by obligation, now seemed revolutionary. She began imagining a week, a month, a year where her happiness and choices were her own. This was the vision that sustained her, a life defined not by giving endlessly to those who did not appreciate it, but by creating a safe, joyful space for herself. As evening approached, Renate felt a sense of peace that was unfamiliar but deeply comforting. She was no longer acting out of fear, guilt, or habit. She was acting out of clarity, self-respect, and intentionality. She knew the road ahead would require vigilance. Max and Lena would not give up easily. But she also knew that her knowledge, documentation, and boundaries had transformed her into someone who could withstand attempts at control. Renate understood that freedom came at a cost, but the cost of inaction, of allowing herself to be exploited, had already been paid. Now she was free to reclaim every aspect of her life, with dignity and resolve. The next morning, Renate woke to the soft light filtering through her curtains, a gentle reminder that a new day had begun, full of potential and possibilities. The previous day's confrontation with Max and Lena still lingered in her mind, but the fear and anger that had once consumed her had been replaced by a quiet determination. She stretched her arms, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease, and took a deep breath, appreciating the calm of her home. The silence, once oppressive, now felt restorative, as if the house itself was breathing alongside her, celebrating her newfound independence. Renate made her way to the kitchen and prepared a simple breakfast, savoring each bite in a way she had long forgotten. She thought about the small routines that had once seemed mundane, but were now symbols of control and self-care. Pouring a second cup of coffee, she decided to write in her journal, an exercise she hadn't maintained for years. Writing had always helped her organize her thoughts, reflect on her emotions, and plan her actions. Today, it served as a tool for empowerment. She noted down the steps she had taken to secure her finances, the boundaries she had enforced, and the contacts she had made for support. Seeing everything on paper gave her a sense of structure and control she had been craving for years. As she wrote, Renate remembered her friend's advice: "You cannot help others effectively if you are depleted yourself." The wisdom of this statement resonated deeply. For decades, she had given endlessly to Max, Lena, and even distant family members, believing that her sacrifices were acts of love. But now, she understood that love without boundaries had left her vulnerable and invisible. She realized that self-care was not selfish. It was essential. Every measure she took to protect her peace, every moment she spent prioritizing herself, was a declaration of her worth. After breakfast, Renate decided to walk in her garden. The early spring air was crisp and invigorating, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. Birds flitted from branch to branch, chirping songs of freedom and resilience. She touched the petals of a daffodil, noticing their vibrant yellow hue and delicate texture. This simple connection with nature grounded her, reminding her that life continued beyond human drama, and that beauty and growth were constants in the world if one took the time to observe them. Walking slowly along the stone path, she reflected on her journey so far. Each decision, each boundary, each act of courage had led her to this moment of clarity. Renate then thought about Max and Lena again, and the manipulations they had employed over the years. The anger that had flared initially now transformed into insight. She saw their actions not as personal failings on her part, but as reflections of their own selfishness and immaturity. Understanding this helped her release the weight of resentment, replacing it with a strategic calm. She began planning how to communicate with them in the future, not from a place of emotion, but from a position of clarity and authority. Her voice, when she finally spoke to them, would be measured, precise, and unwavering. Returning to her living room, Renate spent time organizing her documents, receipts, and personal records. She had always been meticulous, but now her organizational skills took on new significance. Every paper, every folder, every signed form was a piece of her defense and a tool for independence. As she reviewed each document, she felt a quiet pride in her diligence. Years of careful management, once unnoticed and unappreciated, now served as armor in the protection of her life and autonomy. By mid-afternoon, Renate focused on her emotional well-being. She set aside time for meditation, allowing her mind to settle and her heart to open. She reflected on past experiences, acknowledging both pain and joy, and consciously released lingering negativity. The act of letting go was powerful, a cleansing of years of emotional baggage that had weighed her down. She understood that forgiveness, for herself more than for others, was a path to freedom. With each deep breath, she felt lighter, more centered, and more resilient. Later, Renate prepared a simple meal and decided to call a few close friends. These conversations were grounding, filled with genuine care and laughter, reminding her that supportive connections existed outside of toxic family dynamics. She shared small victories, like securing her accounts and setting firm boundaries, and her friends celebrated her courage. The sense of solidarity and understanding reinforced her belief that she could navigate this challenging period without losing herself. As evening approached, Renate lit a few candles, their soft glow casting warm patterns across her walls. She settled into her favorite chair, a cup of herbal tea in hand, and allowed herself to daydream about the future. She imagined vacations she could take, hobbies she could finally explore, and personal goals she could pursue without interference. Each vision, each possibility, filled her with hope and determination. The realization that her life was her own, no longer dictated by manipulation or fear, was profoundly liberating. By nightfall, Renate reflected on the day as a whole. It had been a day of small but significant triumphs. She had acted with intentionality, reclaimed control over her environment, nurtured her emotional health, and strengthened her support network. The foundation of her independence had been solidified, and though challenges would inevitably arise, she felt equipped to face them with clarity, courage, and grace. Renate finally felt a sense of peace, the kind that comes not from avoiding conflict, but from embracing strength, knowledge, and self-respect.